Second keynote speaker, Ms. Ling Lim.
Founder Global, who will share with us on how Asian startups are creating a wave of innovation throughout the world. Please welcome her with a warm round of applause.
네, 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
안녕하세요. OPEC Global Market Launching 담당이사 임이링입니다.
Hello, my name is Ling, the head of the market launch. And I am very delighted to give you a keynote speech in front of you at FlyAsia 2022. Thank you very much for inviting me. And that is pretty much everything I can use as a practical Korean, so I'll turn to an English mode from now on.
Start off by explaining a little bit about 500 Global. We are one of the world's most active venture capital fund. We started off in 2010 in Silicon Valley, and we actually launched a fund in Korea in 2015. And today we have about 30 funds all around the world, and we rebranded to 500 Global last year. So some of you might know us better as 500 Startups. Our thesis is to lead with seed and to invest in founders along the way. So using our accelerator programs and our local funds all around the world, we've managed to invest in over 2,700 companies. And we were also able to then identify the best performing startups and continue investing in them from seed all the way to pre-IPO. So today, we have startups in over 80 countries. And we also have run accelerator and innovation programs of over 120 of them. And so while today's title was called Connecting Asia, Fly to the World, what I'll be spending some time talking about is really my experience in seeing the startup ecosystems all around the world. And not just about how a startup standalone can go global, but rather, if we are ecosystem stakeholders, private and public, how do we build startup ecosystems that gives our startups a better fighting chance in the global arena from the very get-go? And I've been very privileged to be able to travel to startup ecosystems globally, from Alberta in Canada to Israel to Aichi in Japan to Singapore, of course, and to be able to work with public and private sector stakeholders all around these countries. So when we talk about startup ecosystems, we obviously have to start with San Francisco. This is actually the 500 Global office in San Francisco, and I was there in 2019. San Francisco is definitely the mothership of startups, right? It has a lot of natural advantages, from really strong business infrastructure to a lot of entrepreneurial talent, a lot of mentors, a lot of people who've been there, done that, right? It's great sunny as well. And it has access to a huge market, the US market. However, San Francisco always had a problem, and that is high income tax rates in California, as well as rising living costs, right? So it's really hard to live and find a property there. Now, what happened in 2019 was obviously COVID happened. And since then, people found a reason to leave San Francisco, because now remote work, like Richard mentioned earlier, is possible. You don't have to be based at the same place where you work. And so San Francisco have seen people leaving at mass, right? 150 of them actually left in 2021. Tesla moved to Texas, Reddit moved to Florida, even our own CFO moved to Las Vegas, and our COO moved to Saudi Arabia. With the fall or the falling of one ecosystem comes the rise of another. This is in Miami at the pre-money conference that 500 organized end of last year. And it's really vibrant. So Miami also has its natural advantages. Number one, no tax income rate, no state income rate. So really, really low tax rates. Number two, big market. they have a huge access to the LATAM markets as well as European markets. The third, talent pool. Again, because of the access to South American markets, the LATAM markets, they have a huge talent pool there. Did you know that 39% of the professionals working in STEM, in business, in Miami, are actually not originally born in Miami? So they've got all this going for them. And further than that, in 2018, the government, the Knight Foundation, and the Miami Development Downtown Authority decided to put in money to bring in, number one, global VCs in. So 500 actually entered in. We started investing in 2015, but 2018 officially set up a base there and accelerated over 400 startups. Not just us, the Miami government also funded a lot of other accelerators, co-working spaces, and VCs as well. And so this led to a lot of capital coming in. And in last year, SoftBank then announced that they were going to set up a $100 million fund in Miami, and they ended up actually setting up a $250 million fund. But I think the most interesting thing about Miami is the diversity. So really, diversity-wise, they've got such this unique blend of multicultural, multiracial, diverse group, and really it's shown, in the entrepreneurship ecosystem that's being built there. From there, I went to Cairo, Egypt. And honestly, here, I really felt the fire. This is what a booming startup ecosystem looks and feels like. Why do I say that? Number one, huge market, 103 million population, and the median age is 24.6 years old, so really young talent pool. Secondly, huge pool of talent, like I said. But what's just unique about this talent is not just their age, but also that a lot of them actually spend time working outside of Egypt, working in the Middle East. And they were part of like the rocket internet era where they were building ventures in the whole of Middle East, and they're now bringing it back to Egypt. So that experience in working regionally sets a lot of Egyptian startups up for the ability to expand not just in Egypt, but to capture MENA. And that is actually Cairo's goal, to be the startup hub for Middle East, rivaling Saudi Arabia, obviously, who have a lot more money. Then, of course, I have to end this with Singapore, where I'm from. Not to toot our own horn, but Singapore has come a long way in being Asia's startup nation, right? We have 6 million population, but yet we have 4,000 startups and 400 VCs in the ecosystem itself. How did we do that? Since 2001, right? The government has set aside a startup development fund to invest in startups. 2008, they came up with a co-investment scheme, very similar to what Korea has, right, with TIPS and GSA as well. So first, they pumped in the capital. Secondly, they created markets. There's no one to sell to in Singapore. So who do we sell to? Southeast Asia. The government positioned Singapore as a launchpad into the rest of Southeast Asia, however true or not it is. But they created that market. And not just that, they brought corporates in, because corporates are obviously a partner and a market for startups. They have funded over 600 enterprises in Singapore, who launched around 150 open innovation challenges, so that the corporates and the startups can actually partner and cooperate together. And all this are actually funded for by the government. So creating of a market. Now, I do want to end this on a little somber note though, because what I've seen from all the other ecosystems is that there are elements that makes an ecosystem go up, and there are those that makes it come down. And in Singapore, it is none other than talent. We have a huge shortage of talent, and even the entrepreneurs currently in Singapore are solving issues that are very first world issues. What does that mean? That means that we're solving things like, for example, mental health, which is very important. But the market is very limited to a developed market ecosystem. The market is small. Secondly, a lot of startups in Singapore comprise of homogeneous teams. Just like what I said about how Miami is attractive because of the diversity, Singapore has the opposite effect, where a lot of the teams that are formed, the startup founders, are all very homogeneous. And so homogeneous teams creates homogeneous ideas. And so I think we are facing a huge issue, both in terms of talent as well as market. So in Singapore, we have this term, grantpreneur. And this refers to because of the amount of the capital that the government has put in. Are these really entrepreneurs? Or are they grantpreneurs who just go program after program receiving grants? I think by now, you can probably hear the theme in what I was talking about, right? It's talent, it's markets, and it's capital. Those are the three key levers that a startup ecosystem needs in order for the startups to really survive and globalize itself. At 500, we used to have this term called the Eco 6, and we've actually implemented this framework into a lot of the countries where we operate, from Alberta, Aichi, Miami, and Saudi. So I'm going to briefly go through just to summarize the three key levers. The first one that a startup ecosystem needs is access to talent. This could mean local talent coming up, but it can also mean bringing global talent in. So for example, in Egypt and in Saudi, where the population is still young, the government is currently sinking a lot of money into building coding schools, entrepreneurship education, to really set their talent up for the future. In countries like Singapore, the government actually set up Tech Pass and EntrePass in order to attract foreign talent to come in. And just in the past year itself, we've managed to attract 700 top-tier, high-quality serial entrepreneurs to come in based on this pass to build in Singapore. Even in countries like Taiwan and Japan, where we run programs, historically they would just say, let's just focus on Taiwanese and Japanese founders. But in our current programs, we are actually required to include a number of foreign startups into our programs itself as part of the urge out there to go and draw foreign talent in. The second one, access to funding, capital. Again, this is places like where Singapore, while started in 2001 and 2008 to come up with co-investment schemes, because of the current winter climate, where all the startups are facing trouble raising funds, the government last year actually renewed a new co-investment scheme called Seeds Capital, where they will continue co-investing in startups. Not just that, EDBI also set up a new funds of funds scheme. So what does it do? They look for VCs specializing in advanced manufacturing, medtech, as well as agri-tech, and invest in these VCs so that they will then invest in the startups accordingly. Then of course, I think last week you guys would have seen the news in Korea where a lot of Saudi delegation came. Saudi has a lot of money and they are definitely pumping that into the ecosystem. The third one, access to markets. This is one of the most important things that a startup needs, and a startup needs to identify when they are looking at globalizing itself. Again, Korea has a similar program, GSA through KeySet. Singapore has what is called the Global Innovation Alliance, and it has supported 780 startups to go global in across 20 countries, not just the US, but in countries like Indonesia, Philippines, so on and so forth, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. What I think is particularly interesting is in creating markets involving corporates. What Singapore does is it actually funds the corporate to undertake POC and startup partnerships with startups. So it reduces the barrier to entry. It makes it much easier for a corporate to act on it. And this year, they actually expanded the scope. In the past, they will only fund Singaporean corporates partnering with Singaporean startups. Now, they will actually sponsor Southeast Asian corporates and Abu Dhabi corporates who are partnering with Singaporean startups. So it's really creation of the market there itself. We've actually seen this also happen in Japan with one of our partners where they're trying to encourage Japanese corporate to partner with startups. But because there's no funding, honestly, the innovation take-up has been much slower. Okay, so we know the three levers. We talk about the rise and fall of ecosystems itself. Before I end with a part to get you guys to rethink the way that we are building ecosystems, I do want to share three key trends as well that has come up. I don't think any of this will be new to you, but let's just go through them. Okay, the first trend. 43% of startup workforce is likely to be freelance by the end of this year. We saw it in COVID, but it's true. What does this mean for startups? Number one, it means talent is global. You can now hire talent from anywhere. But if you are a country where your engineering talent used to be cheap and you're a startup, let's say for example in the Philippines, where your engineering talent is cheap, you could access them. As a Philippine startup, you had an advantage of hiring. Now, that is no longer the case because you're going to be fighting with startups from Korea, startups from Singapore, startups from Africa, all of whom are hunting for the same engineering tech talent. So this means that the fight for talent is going to be higher, and you have to compete either at lower cost or higher skills. Also, as startups, as you all know, when it comes to cost versus culture fit, cost is always going to win. This was a conference that I was at in Singapore last week, She Loves Tech, which is a female conference. At this conference, as well as a few other conferences the prior weeks, Super Return, Switch, I had one common question asked to me. And that question wasn't, what are the opportunities in Singapore? How is growth looking like in Singapore? No. The question they asked me was, how is it like living in Singapore? Do you like living here? Is it nice? And that tells you about this second trend. For the younger generation, tribe, who is my community, and how livable is this country, matters a lot more. So as we think again about growing global startup ecosystems, creating a space where people feel that I can assimilate in, where I can see myself living in, where I have a community, is going to become more and more important. And the third trend, really important. Here in the picture, you have Merkel Science. Merkel Science actually joined one of our Global Innovation Alliance programs, where they're from Singapore. We took them to the US to help them expand in the US. And they were very lucky to be able to raise funds after they've established themselves in the US. And they managed to raise funds from some US VCs, including 500. However, from what we've been seeing in the market, this is going to become harder and harder. VCs are reserving their dry powders for startups already in their country. What does that mean? A VC in the US is not going to give money to a startup in Korea who is just thinking about expanding to the US. Okay. And the reverse is true too. We've also seen companies wanting to expand into Korea and approaching our Korean funds to say, would you fund us for this expansion? And we can't, because that's not within our mandate. Right? So we cannot fund startups looking to expand into our country unless they are already here, which is really a chicken and egg situation, because startups need funding in order to expand, but no one's going to give them money until they are in that country. So with all those trends, what does this mean? I think it's a little bit moot to really try and work on those same three levers, because every single country is doing the same thing. Every single country is doing co-investment schemes, is doing entrepreneurs, the same thing. So maybe, is there a way we can think a little bit differently in order to yield different results? Right? If you do the same thing, you yield the same results. So what can we do differently? These aren't revolutionary, but I would like to encourage you to see, is there a place where we can put these in place? And maybe come up with your own ideas too. So, number one, on the topic of creating a space, a place where people want to live in, where founders want to come, migrate to, and build their startups from there. We don't need another fintech hub. There's so many competing for that. But we need femtech hubs, right? One of my favorite startups I'm looking at right now is a company called Chief in the US. In 3 years, they became a unicorn. What Chief does is it creates a network for female leaders. 3 years to become a unicorn, that obviously signals that there's a huge market need. So can we change the narrative around what are sexy industries like fintech or health tech, and start focusing more on creating hubs for the not yet sexy industries like femtech, where there's a huge need? Secondly, markets. Every startup thinks about going to the US because it's cool, it's Silicon Valley. But the US does not need another edutech startup from Asia. But Qatar and Saudi Arabia do. The US doesn't need another consumer food tech startup from Asia. But Philippines and Indonesia may. So again, can we change the narrative of the sexy markets versus the currently unsexy but really huge potential markets to expand to? The second one, we talk about attracting talent, and one of the most common things we hear is people say, if I'm in my 30s or my 40s, it's going to be so hard to move to Korea, where I don't speak the language, where the culture I don't understand. It doesn't make sense to uproot my whole family. So why don't we start young, much younger at school? In Singapore, one of the largest, or rather the largest homegrown Singaporean tech company called C Group, the founders are actually Chinese nationals who got attracted and brought to Singapore when they were in high school and university through a talent sponsorship scholarship program that started in the 1990s. Back then, we would look at academic scores. But why can't we do the same? But looking for young potential entrepreneurs instead and bringing them to the country, to Asia, where they can start building from here, their new home. We talk a bit about capital, right? About how US VCs are just not interested in Korea or Japan or Taiwan. It's not a big enough market for them. They are not looking at funding startups coming from here. They are not invested in bringing a Korean startup to the US and funding the expansion. So can we do better with the government grants currently available? Can governments, or really capital sources, funding sources, fund VCs, global expansion VC, set up a new kind of VC where the mandate is clearly to invest in startups where the use of proceeds is to expand into a new market? This one is something I've been toying around a lot with, and I've heard a lot of people tell me, nope, ethnic diversity. A founding team comprising of people from different races, different ethnicity will not work because we speak a different language, we have different cultures, we won't know how to resolve conflicts. Information flow is going to be slow. Such founding teams doesn't work. Well, guess what? A report that did a survey and analyzed thousands of data from an accelerator programs since 2007 all the way until 2021 actually disproved that theory. And they found that ethnic diversity is an advantage. And ethnically diverse founding teams end up raising more capital in the long run itself. And the reason for that is simple. When your whole founding team comprises of ethnically diverse people, number one, you have diverse mind frames, and that drives innovation. But more tangibly, these people come with access to networks in their own home countries, understanding issues that spans Indonesia to Korea to Taiwan, and hence sets them up better for success when they are looking at expanding into different global markets itself. Why is this important, and why should we really think about this? By 2055, in the US, there will be no ethnic majority group anymore. It's so diverse. So in order for a startup to be able to create solutions that can serve this new ecosystem, this new market, you need a globally diverse team that comes from this diverse background itself. And so instead of thinking, how do we build and then be global? Maybe we ought to be rethinking, how do we build global founding teams from the get-go? And then lastly, back to the topic today, connecting Asia, fly to the world. I don't think that is possible. Not until we stop competing against each other in Asia, not until we stop paying Startup Genome to increase our cities' ranking in their report. I don't know if you read that Startup Genome report, which rates every single city on a ranking scale. You can actually pay for that. So until we stop doing that, there's no way we can conquer as Asia to the world. But if we look back to our roots, within Asia itself, we have APEC. We've always been very clear which country is strong in which industries. right? And we conquered the world that way. Tech seemed to have equalized the playing field. For example, Web3 is new. Everyone is then fighting, right, to be the next Web3 hub. Or health tech is relatively new. Everyone is then fighting to be the next health tech or fintech hub. But can we think about how we can divide based on our desired strengths and focus area, and then conquer Asia as a whole, exporting to the rest of the world, so that they truly see Asia as one whole source of anything that you ever need in next-gen technology? Can we do that? So I will urge all of you to think differently, and let's be building global first. 감사합니다.